The Vampire Tour of London by Kitty Burns, with Syra Kingsley as the tour guide.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Lucy Westenra, and I would like to thank you for coming to hear how vampires have played an important role in the history of London. Have any of you read the book Dracula by Bram Stoker? Those of you who have read the story of how I was first introduced to Count Dracula in 1897. My friend Mina Harker was banished by the master to San Francisco after being transformed by him and making a feeble attempt at defiance. I didn't want to suffer the same fate of being deported from my home, so I have been a faithful servant of the master ever since my transformation. I am here, hopefully, to answer some of your questions about vampires, particularly here in London. I know how curious you mortals are. You're always trying to find our resting places. Let me save you a little time and trouble. As you may or may not know, the Highgate Cemetery in London was Bram Stoker's inspiration for writing his masterpiece Dracula. That was no coincidence. It is in that cemetery that you will find me resting during the day. But heed my warning. If you come looking for me, do not come alone, and do not come after dark. If you really are brave, or foolish enough to invade the sacred ground on which I rest, follow these directions. When you enter the cemetery, go right along Perrin's Lane, where you will see quaint brick cottages. Go right onto Heath Street and cross onto Church Row. One of the houses near the church is said to have been the scene of a gruesome murder in the late 1800s. The murderess was a red-headed servant who dismembered the body of her victim and smuggled it out of the house in a carpet bag. People walking along Church Row at daybreak have been known to hear stealthy footsteps shuffling behind them. When they turn to see who is following them, they see a red-headed woman turning her head nervously from side to side, as if to make sure she is not being followed. She is heading quickly towards the church. I don't know of any who have stayed around long enough to see if she actually enters the church. However, if you are brave enough to continue at this point, you must follow her ghostly trail through the gates of the parish church of St. John. Make an immediate left and follow the path as it curves its way past the decrepit tombs. As the ground turns sharply to the right and changes to asphalt, you will pass the tomb of the artist John Constable. Walk to the end of that path, go right, and take the right uphill fork, passing beneath the massive trees that shadow you and the graves. This is where I return, at the end of each night, just before the sun rises. This is the tomb that imprisons me in the ground every day until the following sunset. A countless number of sightings of a red-eyed creature that could turn to smoke resulted in the cemetery becoming a camping ground for numerous researchers, reporters, and the most infamous of journalists, the paparazzi. This apparition became known as the Smoky Vampire. The sightings died down after legal action was taken against one of the vampire hunters. Wonder who initiated that?
Soho.
I was instructed by the master to conduct my vampire tour in London for many reasons, mainly to clear up numerous rumours and myths that you may have been told about us. In the 16th century, the Soho area consisted of open fields, which were used by the court as hunting grounds. Back then, the hunters used to yell "Soho" instead of "Tally-ho," which is now why the area has become known as Soho Fields. The hunters' theme song was "Soho Fields Forever." Sorry, couldn't resist. Anyway, the main features in the Soho area in the 16th century are still some of the main features here today, such as Oxford Street, Swallow Street, and Regent Street. Today, Soho is London's busiest nightlife area and includes pubs, clubs, and theatres. The Soho area used to be plagued with drug trafficking and several adult shops, and people think vampirism is depraved. You should talk. Well, I'm happy to report that the vampire community has removed the majority of the drug dealers, as well as many of the adult shops, and has replaced them with various wonderful coffee houses. The vampire community has gone to great lengths to bring Soho an air of respectability. We do appreciate a good story now and then, though, so we do allow folklore and horror stories to be told, as long as they don't mock us. We don't mind if you mock some of the other creatures lurking about the area, though. In fact, one of our own songwriters with a sense of humour has even written about the werewolves of London in the Soho area with their perfect hair and their yen for chow mein.
Piccadilly Circus.
Piccadilly Circus is one of London's most famous locations. The name Piccadilly actually evolved from the devastating era in London's history haunted by the plague. The unfortunate victims of the plague were cursed not only with a deadly disease, but with a stench comparable to one of a shallow grave. In an attempt to disguise this horrendous odour, people would trek for miles to this area, which at that time was covered with dillies, because these flowers have a very strong, pleasant scent. The people would pick a handful of dillies and place them in each of their pockets in order to drown out the stench of the plague. When they came to do this, they would tell their family and friends that they were going to pick a dilly, thus the name. The nightlights of Piccadilly Circus are often compared to Times Square in New York City. However, Piccadilly has one major advantage over Times Square. Pedestrians here don't take their lives in their hands when they try to cross the street. Well, the danger doesn't come from the cars anyway. People who are brave enough to venture into Piccadilly Circus at night put themselves at risk in another way. Below Piccadilly Circus is the headquarters of the London vampire community. We have occupied this portion of the London Underground for the last 6 centuries. I myself am proud to be a member of the most elite clan in London, known as the Imperial Stalkers. Our leader, Prince Douglas, was chosen personally by Count Dracula in 1587 and has taken the clan to unprecedented heights through his bravery and cunning strategies. In an attempt to distract the mortals darting about on their way to and from night shops, theatres, pubs and clubs in Soho and Leicester Square, a variety of clan members have been placed in Piccadilly Circus to create a diversion. They pose as bagpipe players, flamethrowers and mimes to keep the tourists entertained while the clan scopes out their meals for the evening. It is the ultimate beggar's banquet. Some vampires have been in existence for so many centuries, their skin eventually becomes a whiter shade of pale. This is why the presence of mimes appears to be everywhere. It is a perfect cover, and the disguise is effortless for the unfortunate vampires. However, vampires are not the only predators in this area. Lycanthropes, otherwise known as werewolves, also prowl the streets at night, seeking out their prey. The movie An American Werewolf in London even tried to warn people that werewolves were roaming the streets, particularly in Piccadilly Circus. Werewolves are not any relation to the vampire community, of course, and are actually quite a nuisance to us as well as you. They wreak havoc on the people of London, and at times we are blamed for their disastrous sloppiness, which is not only unfair, but downright insulting. Secrecy is of the utmost importance to the vampire community, and because of this, we never leave behind any unsightly mess. Unlike werewolves, we are far above that sort of behaviour. Besides, the best way to keep your identity a secret is to be careful not to leave any tracks or evidence. And to do this, you must tidy up after yourself. This is actually quite easy for a vampire. I mean, think about it. When we feed, we suck the blood out of a mortal. This is our nourishment, and like you, we enjoy our meals. Why would we want to leave a bloody mess after feeding? If a vampire does that, he didn't finish his meal. You are raised with instructions to clean your plate. We may not eat off plates, but we do follow the same principle. Werewolves, on the other hand, are much less dignified and show very little class when it comes to etiquette. It is an honour and a privilege to be chosen by the vampire community as a part of the feeding of the elite clan every night. Not just anyone can be selected. In order to be eligible for this nightly ritual, you have to possess at least one of the following qualifications. Either you need to be a resident of London, or you must be an adult male or female with some genetic connection to royalty, or, and this is most important, you must have lived during the time of some war in the mortal world. If you can claim at least one of these restrictions, then eventually you will be chosen.
The Tube.
One of the abandoned tubes, known as ghost stations, is the setting for the underground sequence in An American Werewolf in London. The film was produced by Lycanthrope Productions, respectfully named with the medical term for werewolf. Yes, you heard it right. I said medical term. Aldwych Station, which opened as the Strand in 1907 before being renamed in 1915, is one of more than 40 stations in the underground which are no longer used. Built on the site of the Royal Strand Theatre, there have been many sightings of ghostly figures there, particularly during and after World War I, when it was used as an air raid shelter. Today, the station is hired out as a film set, even a party venue. That's quite a leap from an air raid shelter. There are several lines in the underground known as deep level lines. They are Bakerloo, Central, Jubilee, Northern, Piccadilly, Victoria and Waterloo and City lines. Not all of these railways have abandoned stations on their tracks, but those that do can take you to places you have never even imagined. These sections are much deeper than the subsurface sections, with the deepest point on the whole tube network being just north of Hampstead, under Hampstead Heath, at 220 feet deep. One of the most famous British phrases comes from the London Underground: mind the gap. This phrase originally served two purposes. It was first used concerning the underground trains on the Northern Line, where the gaps between the curved train platforms at Embankment Station and the train itself were particularly large. The largest gaps one needs to mind are at Bank Station on the Central Line and at Waterloo Station on the Bakerloo Line. After a number of mortals had injured themselves by being in such a hurry to exit the underground trains that they were not paying attention to what was beneath their feet, we realised that it was necessary to announce to you that there is a need to be cautious when leaving the trains. We found this pretty amusing, but apparently it has helped you. So what started as a joke has become an integral part of a London tradition. There is also a very amusing story about the phrase mind the gap. The vampire community below the underground platforms uses the gaps in the platforms to exit the community each night and enter above on the streets of London. Although transforming ourselves into mist is the most discreet way of entering into the mortal world, there are times when we just can't resist being a little more showy. This has resulted in a story that has been adopted as an urban legend about large gap bats that are rumoured to roost in the underground tunnels. According to the legend, the gap bats were smuggled into London in the early 19th century by French saboteurs and have proved impossible to exterminate. Gee, I wonder why. According to the story, the announcement, "Mind the gap," is a signal that you should grab your hair and look towards the ceiling to avoid being attacked by a gap bat. Very few people have ever been killed by gap bats, so the story is rarely taken seriously. We love it when that happens. Being made a part of your urban legends makes things so easy for us. People feel foolish if they admit to believing urban legends, but we know that there are a lot of mortals who are intelligent enough to decipher the true stories from the false ones. And then there are others. Those are the fun ones. Mind the Gap has also become a part of London's pop culture. It has been used as a title of a TV game show, a pictorial book about the London Underground, and the recorded announcement heard in the tube has been used in 2 popular songs by London bands. A 1970s horror movie starring Donald Pleasance and Christopher Lee uses a variation of the phrase quite often. The movie actually has been filmed under 2 titles. The British version is known as The Death Line, and the American version is called Raw Meat. In these movies, ghoulish, man-eating underground troglodytes are constantly repeating the phrase, "Mind the doors." The movie is about a turn-of-the-century cave-in on the London Underground. Donald Pleasance plays a detective investigating a string of murders who is puzzled by an unexplainable lack of corpses. Presumably they were eaten by the cannibal tube dwellers from days of yore. The poster for the movies delightfully describes the real stars of the movie by saying, "Beneath modern London, buried alive in its plague-ridden tunnels, lives a tribe of once humans. Neither men nor women, they are less than animals. They are raw meat of the human race." Charming, isn't it? But let's get back to reality. Several ghosts have been seen and heard in various parts of the London Underground. These events have been well documented and confirmed time and time again. A 13-year-old trainee hatmaker, Anne Naylor, was murdered in 1758 by her trainer and the trainer's daughter. People claim to hear her cries echoing down Farringdon Station. She has been nicknamed the Screaming Spectre. South Kensington is the site of not just a ghost, but this sighting also includes a ghost train. This would be a contemporary version of the pirate ship the Black Pearl, made famous by the movie Pirates of the Caribbean. The train was first spotted by a passenger from the last westbound tube, who saw a train pull into the South Kensington station in December 1928. An ear-piercing whistle broke through the night, and the passenger saw a ghostly figure in a reefer jacket and a peaked cap hanging from the side of the train's engine. Both the man and the train then vanished into the tunnel, never to be seen again. When the Elephant and Castle station is closed, people say that you can hear the steps of an invisible runner, strange tappings and doors being thrown open. A tube driver on the London Underground told reporters of his encounter with the spirit. He was waiting for the driver of the train to arrive and moved to the rear of the train to wait for him. While he was waiting, a girl got into the carriage. He stepped aside to let her pass him. Just after this happened, the driver turned up and they both moved to the front of the train. He noticed that the girl was not in the carriage, which immediately concerned him since she could not have left the train without passing him again. He told the driver because the only other thing the girl could have done is to walk down the tunnel. The driver's response was not what he expected to hear. He calmly said, "Oh, her. We hear about her all the time. She's even been in the papers." This ghost is seen so often, most people are not even fazed by the experience anymore.
Covent Garden.
The tube at Covent Garden that most of you probably took to get to this tour has a very special resident. The spirit of a tall man in a frock coat, tall hat and gloves is said to be pacing the tunnels and has been seen consistently since the 1950s, when he appeared in the staff restroom. The staff demanded a transfer, but I guess reporting that you've seen a ghost is not sufficient grounds to transfer from a job in London. The ghost is that of an actor named William Terrace, who was fatally stabbed by another actor near the Adelphi Theatre in the Strand in December 1897. Apparently, William liked to visit a baker's shop which stood where today's tube station was built. Terrace still makes occasional cameos in the underground. His spirit has since been witnessed by rail workers travelling through the tunnels from Covent Garden towards Holborn. Maybe he got tired of waiting for the ghost train and decided to walk. In 1761, a man called Jack Harris began a whores club in Covent Garden. Jack saw himself as somewhat of an 18th century publicity agent rather than a pimp. He helped the careers of his clients by publishing a yearly chapbook which contained brief PR releases on all the girls working in the area. He would charge 10 guineas and a half a crown for their service. Is it just me? Or does anybody else seem to recall another Jack that was associated with prostitutes in London? Anyway, in order for a girl to have her name included in the directory, she had to pay a portion of her previous earnings to Jack, who would act as a liaison between her and the boards or madams. He would find employment for the working girls and employees for the madams. Jack was very good to his ladies. He used the club's funds to help working girls when they became sick or were down on their luck. After Jack died in 1766, the writer Sam Derrick took on the task of publishing the directory, and he continued to do so until the time he succeeded Beau Nash as Master of Ceremonies at Bath. Jubilee Hall, one of the highlights of Covent Garden, was originally built in 1904 as part of the Covent Garden wholesale fruit and vegetable market. It was redeveloped and opened again in 1987. But soon after excavation began in 1985, a gruesome discovery was made. It turned out that the northeast corner under two former house plots was only semi-basemented, and beneath it laid a layer of dark soil deposits of a mysteriously decayed organic matter. Further scraping revealed a narrow rectangle of discoloured soil, which someone centuries before had dug out and then replaced the dirt and gravel. It was a shallow grave. Digging carefully by hand, an archaeological team uncovered the remains of a human skeleton. It lay on an east-west axis of the ancient layer and may have been buried in an open field between 530 and 675 AD. It was an adult male laying face down with his hands pushed to the right side of his body. His wrists had possibly been tied together, and he seemed to have been rolled into the grave. A lone burial of this type, in the prone position, usually indicates that the deceased was an outcast, a stranger or a criminal, most likely buried alive. History books will tell you that this archaeological find proved what had been a mystery for several centuries, the location of Middle Saxon London in the 7th to 9th centuries. They had to find some way to explain how something so horrifying could be found in London in the 20th century. The most startling and famous discovery was that of the headless Saxon skeleton. The history of Saxon London was a perfect alibi for covering up the truth about the city's secrets. The vampire community residing beneath London has set several traps that historians have eagerly adopted as explanations for many of history's mysteries. Once we decided to allow some of our older secrets, which are no longer of use to us, to be revealed, your typical mortal curiosity welcomed our revelations with open arms. People are so eager to explain what they don't understand, and you've made it very easy for us to convince you of whatever it is we choose. I'm not saying that you're not intelligent, because you are. Your hunger to learn proves that. I'm merely saying that you make it easy for us to feed that hunger. And as you know, feeding is our speciality. Another spirit who wanders the streets of Covent Garden is one of the most famous English queens of all time, Anne Boleyn. While her husband, King Henry VIII, had absolute power, like most wives, Anne actually ruled him in many ways. In fact, if not for her miscarriage of 2 sons, she would have been Henry's second and last wife. Anne came to court as a handmaiden to Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, but quickly gained favour despite her physical abnormality. She had 11 fingers and an unnaturally giraffine neck. She was known to those who hated her as the goggly-eyed whore. However, her failure to bear an heir for Henry was the first and the only nail in her coffin. She had the book thrown at her with preposterous charges of witchcraft and incest. Anne was banished from court to Durham House on the southern side of Covent Garden. For the last and gloomiest months of her life, Anne Boleyn resided there, answering accusations which everyone knew to be false. Her living corpse was taken to the Tower for execution, but she left her soul in Covent Garden, and now her spirit has joined it. On occasion, her ghost can still be seen on Durham House Street. She wanders in a crimson gown, seemingly aimlessly, and with an eerie frosty aura. Her countenance, unlike when she haunts the tower as an amorphous ghost, is said to be unmistakably that of Boleyn, with the long neck and the bonus finger, and her head tucked beneath her arm. That's a lovely visual. We all have the utmost respect for doctors and anyone in the medical field. That is what makes the next two stories particularly disturbing. George Beeman, surgeon to the parish of St Paul's, Covent Garden, made his mark in London's history in a most unpleasant way. The subjects for his studies were not just recently deceased, but so recently that their souls hadn't even had time to leave their bodies. Upon receipt of one of his subjects, he turned back the scalp of the corpse that lay before him. The body of a boy about 14 years old had been delivered to King's College Anatomy Department for the medical students to dissect. The heart contained little blood, suggesting a sudden death. His other organs were healthy, and he had 2 small holes on the side of his neck, and black bruises from finger marks on his forearm. This indicated that it had apparently been a violent death. The marks on his neck barely aroused the good doctor's suspicion. There was nothing so unusual about that in 1830s London. What perplexed Beeman more was how fresh the corpse was. It had obviously neither been buried nor laid out for burial. Who would deliver a body to him that was so fresh and completely drained of its blood? Dr. Beeman estimated the boy had been dead for about 3 days. The long investigation that ensued would lead back to the East End, to Bethnal Green's notorious Yargo Quarter, and to charges of not only murder, but vampirism. The whole business of body snatching and the resurrection men who dealt in the trade had been stimulated by advances in the science of medicine and anatomy. Prior to the 18th century, medicine had been a most unscientific business, killing as many as it cured, but doctors were now seeking a greater understanding of how the human body worked. Performing dissections of fresh corpses was the main way for them to learn. The only legal supply of flesh came from the gallows, but though the 17th century had seen hundreds executed each year, often for the most trivial crimes, in the 1800s, only 55 people were being hanged each year in England and Wales, while the medical schools needed around 500 cadavers. What's a doctor to do? Luckily for the doctors, the law turned a blind eye to the practice of digging up freshly buried bodies. This became known as resurrection. The corpse was deemed to belong to no one, so logically it could not be stolen. As long as the body snatchers didn't pinch shrouds or coffin lids, they faced only a fine or at worst 6 months' jail. The business in London was centred on the Nova Scotia Gardens area of Spitalfields, originally weavers' cottages, but by the 1830s it had become an increasingly subdivided slum property. Why did resurrection work become so popular with the EastEnders? Money, of course. In 1831, a skilled silk weaver in the East End could earn 5 shillings for a 72-hour week of back-breaking work. But a fresh corpse could fetch £8, £9 or even £10, with all the work done in a day. Male corpses were worth more than those of a female, as they gave greater scope for examination of the musculature. and a fresh corpse was much more valuable than a mouldering cadaver. No wonder it became a competitive trade, with a number of East End teams racing to supply fresh bodies to West End doctors. Another prominent physician who liked his bodies fresh was Dr. John Bishop. He had missed out on more than one occasion when a rival had gotten to a body first. So, with doctors ordering bodies, the fresher the better, it was only logical that the resurrection men should start providing corpses to order. It was also a lot less messy than disturbing a grave. The final irony? Dr. Bishop was hanged and sent straight to the surgeons. It was noted that he was a particularly fine physical specimen. He would have fetched a handsome price. Don't you just love irony?
The Royal Opera House.
After many redesigns and total reconstructions, this building is now the Royal Opera House, the third theatre on the Covent Garden site. For about the first 100 years of its history, the theatre was primarily a playhouse. The first serious musical works to be heard at Covent Garden were the operas from Handel. From 1735 until his death in 1759, he performed regular seasons there, and many of his operas and oratorios were written for Covent Garden or had their first London performances there. Handel bequeathed his organ to the theatre, and it was placed in an honoured position facing the Queen's box. Unfortunately, it was among many valuable items lost in a fire that destroyed the theatre in 1808. Rebuilding began at once. The foundation stone, later incorporated in the present structure, was laid by the Prince of Wales, who later became King George IV in 1808, and the second Theatre Royal, Covent Garden, opened a year later with a performance of Macbeth. It was at this production that the audience began to notice something peculiar about the cast and the characters they were portraying. William Shakespeare's plays are very carefully worded, and because they were written centuries ago, it is assumed that most of his characters are fictitious. There are the obvious true characters, such as King Henry IV, but most of the others are assumed to be a product of Shakespeare's fast imagination. Ask any playwright, almost all characters are derived from real mortals. Shakespeare was no exception to this rule. We get the biggest kick out of people who actually take classes to understand what he is saying. It is very rare that a director or actor is aware enough to correctly understand the full meaning behind Shakespeare's words. But in 1809 in Covent Garden, one of the true productions of Macbeth took place in this theatre. It wouldn't be any fun if I told you everything and divulged all the secrets, so I'll just give you one major hint of an example to which I am referring. One of the most famous and most quoted lines in theatre history is the cry of Lady Macbeth as she bellows, "Out, damn Spot!" It is emphasised that she has found it impossible to get the blood of her victims off her hands. She is a perfect example of the sloppiness I spoke of earlier, that is not tolerated by the elite clans of the vampire community of London. Shakespeare felt compelled to make her character in one of his plays as an example to other vampires as to what will happen if you do not abide by the ordinances of the community, not to mention the master.
The Moon Underwater.
Moon Underwater is the largest free house in London and is owned by the Wetherspoon Company, which means that it is fun and affordable for both food and drinks. The building is blessed with an admirable musical history. Moon Underwater was once known as the Marquee Club, where British icons such as the Beatles, the Rolling Stones and the Who used to play. Take a minute and just picture John, Paul, George and Ringo walking through that door. Some of the other buildings that J.D. Wetherspoon converted were former banks, auto showrooms, cinemas, theatres, a post office, and even my personal favourite, a funeral parlour. This pub is built on the site of the city's first municipal swimming baths. That, along with the current title of the establishment, seems to be a hint at dismissing the absurd rumour that vampires cannot cross over water. At first we thought that Moon underwater would be a bit too obvious and that you would realise immediately who was running the business, but apparently not. Although the outside of the building doesn't look especially exciting, the inside still vibrates with the memories of its past performers. Why don't we go inside and soak in the atmosphere as you suck up something to drink, so to speak? I would be happy to join you inside, but I will not be indulging with you. I never drink spirits. Before we go inside, I would like to thank you all for joining me on the Vampire Tour of London this evening. I hope you have learned a little more about us and that I have cleared up some of the myths that are only true in your fiction. Remember, if you do venture outside of London to visit the beautiful English countryside, enjoy the scenery, but be safe. Stick to the roads. Stay off the moors.
The Vampire Tour of London by Kitty Burns was a free theatre company production. Produced and directed by Robert Chantler and narrated by Syra Kingsley.